it started with it had a long gestation, as it were. So just briefly, the background was that, Nelson Mandela came out of jail in 1990. He becomes president of the country in 1994. Unlike many, many leaders, he says, guys, my life was not about becoming president of the country. I'm just going to do this for 5 years and I'm out of here. So, people like me, others are, oh, Mandela, you're amazing. Go for a second term. He says, no, thank you. Bye-bye. I'm not doing this. He gets out. Thabo Mbeki takes over. And, Thabo Mbeki's bright guy, master's degree from Sussex University, fought against apartheid his whole life. But he's got to come after Mandela, and it's a tough thing to have to do. But he does it. And then in 2007, the ANC gets rid of him. And after 9 years in power, he's kicked out in a democratic way. And Jacob Zuma takes over. Now, Jacob Zuma is controversial figure. As he comes to the presidency of the party, the ANC, Nelson Mandela's party, he is accused of rape. He is on trial for corruption, for taking kickbacks from people connected to him to allow an arms deal for South Africa to buy arms from the UK, Saudi Arabia, and all sorts of other places and so forth. So very controversial. People like me start writing that this is not the right guy for this country. This is not the right guy for this country. And people say, oh, you're being, so people strut us aside. And the ruling party appoints him, elects him. And in 2009, the people of South Africa overwhelmingly vote for him, and he becomes president. So essentially, for people like me who are writing about politics, it's, wow, this guy's made it. So give him a little chance. Let's see what he does. But the scandals don't stop. Every week there is something new, and new charges, new allegations of corruption and so forth. So there was a fantastic publisher in South Africa, that the kind of guy, when you're a kid and you're reading books and they say, oh yeah, there was this publisher and he spent his time in a restaurant, entertaining writers. This guy, Jonathan Ball was his name, was a bit like that. He invites me to lunch. I love lunch. So, so I go out, I meet him, and he always took me, in my case, he'd take me to this fish restaurant in Johannesburg that, had a great wine cellar and, had a great name in the city for being where the movers and shakers of the country always meet. So go there, and he says, Justice, I've been reading your columns. You gotta write a book out of this. You gotta, you're angry about what's happening. Say something. And I said, oh, my books have always been, I did the slim thing. I did the collection. I don't think I can do a book. He says, come on, man, you can do it. And over about 2 years, 3 years, he keeps on, so the lunches are great. He coaxes it out of me, and then I start kind of so I went away actually for a couple of weeks. My daughter is a surfer, so she'd go out surfing and I had to take her, and surfing in Cape Town is in cold water, and there's usually wind, and it's not very pleasant. It's not California surfing. It's quite tough. So she'd go out in the water and I'd be sitting on the beach, kind of, waiting for her to come back in. And I kind of started scribbling the opener, and suddenly I had a bit of something. And then I started, leaving my daughter to surf, and I'd go in the restaurant opposite and bash it out a bit. Showed it to Jonathan, and he liked it. And he had an editorial director who said, no, keep going. I think you might be onto something. Few months, and then they start saying, no, you're onto something, keep going, do so. But I'm not getting the time. Then I took a month off and went and locked myself up in a cottage in Cape Town and just bashed it out as much as I could. But I'd had a lot of, I'd had a lot of material I'd scribbled down. So it was really just pulling it together by then. And Jonathan Ball published it. And yeah, I mean, I didn't sort of expect it to be, to take off as much as it did. But it did. And what's been gratifying for me, even when I now live in the US, I've been living in the US for 4.5 years. But as I speak to you now, I'm visiting South Africa. I came here for a wedding and a few things. But I get on the plane to go to Cape Town from Johannesburg, and the air stewardess says to me, "Oh, you're the guy who wrote a book about our pilots," because the title, I was flying and I was. This is when Jonathan Ball said, now you have a deadline," and I was typing on it, but I didn't have a title for it. And as you fly into Johannesburg, flying into Johannesburg, and the pilot as usual says, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have now begun our descent." And I said, that's the title. And I spoke about it once. And so, people kind of, and it's got a life of its own in South Africa, where people still say, "Oh, Justice, you said it, we've begun our descent." So the lights go out and people will say, "Oh, we've begun our descent." But it's, it was a good book for me. It was worked out nicely. You talk about a full circle. This book was full circle for me, because I was telling you about being a kid, joining the Star newspaper and being sort of bright-eyed and, oh, my heroes are writing their stuff out there. So April 10, 1993, I was at the cadet school, as they called it. It's the training internship that they had. And it was Easter weekend. And Easter weekend is like Thanksgiving in South Africa. Everyone just scatters and goes to family. So that's the weekend you go and fight with your family over politics and your uncles and so forth. So that weekend of April 10, 1993, I'm an intern, and the news editor says to the guy who was in charge of training, "I need those rookies to come up and work this weekend because I've got no reporter." And so the 10th of April was actually my first day on the job. So I'm sitting there, and the news editor comes up to the newsroom and says, "Chris Hani has been murdered." Now, Chris Hani was the most popular politician in South Africa after Nelson Mandela. He was the head of the ANC's Liberation Army. He was charismatic. He was relatively young. He was 50 years old, but by South African politics standards, he was young. He was youthful. He was incredibly charming across the board. So he was negotiating with Mandela. They'd have the apartheid guys across the table, and he'd arrive and talk to those guys about Greek mythology, about Sophocles, and these guys would be sitting there and say, "This guy is a communist, he's a terrorist, how can he know this stuff?" And they loved him. And so the apartheid guys gravitated towards him, like, "Oh yeah, so what do you think of?" They discuss Shakespeare and so forth. And then he'd go out on the streets to those areas that I used to cover, the violent townships, and he'd stand in front of thousands and thousands of people, calm them down and said, "We're not here for war, let's stop the violence," and so forth and so forth. So on that weekend, an anti-communist assassin, an immigrant from Poland, stalked this guy, followed him to his house, shot him 4 times, and killed him in front of his 13-year-old daughter. And so that was my first as it were, my first story. That was my first story at the Star. I'd written some other stuff before in a freelance capacity, but that was my first time. So I get sent out there to Don Park, to Chris Honey's house. I get there, there's hundreds of journalists already, activists have arrived, all sorts of people are there. And it's go, 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 go. I do a few interviews, I transcribe them, I send them back, and so forth. But actually, what was happening was that the country was descending into war. It was, Nelson Mandela in his book says, that day, that week, was the week that I feared most, that South Africa would regress and would go not what we'd seen with apartheid, and it would be race war, black against white. F.W. de Klerk, who was the president of the country at the time, says exactly the same thing. In reflection, he says, I knew that this was it. This was the moment that would tip it. But, you know, in that week, the story went on. I went back downstairs to the classroom, and we went on. But that week was when I thought, wow, everything that a guy like me, young guy, lived under apartheid, I thought we were walking away from apartheid. But that week, I thought, it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. People were impassioned, were inflamed. It was fire. So I've always wanted to go back to write a book about why didn't what I thought would happen, what Mandela thought would happen, what de Klerk thought would happen, that racial war, why didn't it happen? Why didn't we implode that week? So this book follows that first day, the 10th of April of the assassination, and it follows Mandela and F.W. de Klerk to a certain extent over the next 9 days as this monster of anger and fear and recrimination beats each other up, and violence essentially flares across the country. For the first time, you had full-on racial killings. You had blacks taunted on the streets, you had whites attacked in the streets and so forth. It looked bad. It was, so I tried to chronicle and take it day by day and say, maybe these are some of the things that happened that stopped the war, that stopped the anger. And in a way, I see it as a bit of a leadership book about what leaders in very tough crisis times, what good leaders do, and Mandela and de Klerk in those first few days did some things that I think point to a deep, transcendent leadership style that many others wouldn't have done. So that's the book really. And I wanted to, so your question about full circle is, that was my full circle. I wanted to go back to that first day at the Star and actually write the story that I didn't write then, if you will.